Hello, everyone.
Great.
I'm
Thanks.
Michelle Malanka with the World Green Building Council. Thank you for joining our Sustainable Cities Initiative speaker series. The Sustainable Cities Initiative is a collaborative effort of national green building councils to support the creation of greener, healthier, more prosperous cities everywhere. Today, we are very pleased to be hearing from the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities program. Originally scheduled to speak was Byrna Lipper, but unfortunately Byrna has fallen ill. But here, riding to the rescue, is Lauren Sorkin, Platform Director with the 100 Resilient Cities program. Lauren has extensive experience working in the Asia-Pacific region, including with the Asian Development Bank, and working to promote climate-responsive development. Lauren's going to be speaking with us today about the 100 Resilient Cities program, what they mean by urban resiliency, and what the momentum around urban resiliency means for the building and construction sector. Lauren will be speaking to us for about 25 minutes, and then we're going to have about 20 minutes for discussion and for questions. For those of you wishing to ask questions, please go ahead and use the chat box on the right-hand side of your panel. And with that, I will go ahead and hand over to Lauren. Lauren, I'm going to be on mute, but I'll just push the slides forward as you request.
Great. Thanks so much, Michelle, and thanks to everyone who's joined the call today. It's really a pleasure to note our definition of resilience here and what 100 Resilient Cities is doing. So just to start off, what I'll be covering is our definition of resilience and our approach, really what the vision of the program is, why we've chosen to focus on urban areas, some examples of what we consider to be examples of resilience, and then where there hasn't been resilience, what the consequences are, and then I'll go into some detail about the program, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that anyone has about the program at the end of the presentation. So first of all, 100 Resilient Cities is pioneered by the Rockefeller Foundation. It was launched on the occasion of Rockefeller Foundation's centennial, and therefore there are 100 Resilient Cities, and it's a $100 million investment in improving resilience planning and action in cities. Next slide. So I'm going to introduce what our introduction of urban resilience is. Next slide. So the reason that the program is focusing on urban resilience is because we're faced in a time now where there's a confluence of three trends: urbanization and change. And there's a recognition that people are really drawn to cities as centers of economic activity, social connection, opportunity, and innovation, and that these three trends are going to create larger challenges and more frequent challenges, that really crisis in many ways is the new norm, and we need to be ready to respond. So next slide. You can see that sudden shocks, accumulating stresses, can both lead to breakdown, physical collapse, or economic decline. Right. England, our definition of resilience covers more than natural disasters or at times the definition of climate change resilience, but rather extends to both social and also economic resilience. And as we see here, shocks can be the result of economic or social pressures on any given community. Next slide, please. This is a list of some of the shocks and that we hear from cities are the most troubling, and these are the issues that we try to address through the program, and these really take the temperature of cities. What are they really thinking about? What are they having trouble with? So both acute shocks and also chronic and longer term stresses. You can see here changing demographics. We hear from a lot of our cities about aging population and how to manage public health issues around that, aging infrastructure, in particular transport infrastructure and heavy traffic, in acute shocks, earthquakes, and flooding really rank among the top stresses that we hear about from many of our cities. And what we want to see in terms of resilience is the city's ability to maintain their essential functions in spite of having more and more acute shocks and stresses. Next slide, please. So here are a few different developments, and what you can see here is that at the time of the shock or stress, there, of course, is a potential for a city to falter and for development to decline, but what we're trying to foster within the program is an outlook of shocks and stresses as an opportunity to reorient and to try to really jump forward and have a better path for development and build back. Next slide, please. This is the definition of urban resilience that we use at 100 Resilient Cities. And as I like to often say, it's boldly broad because it really encompasses a great many actors as well as functions of the city. So as you see here, urban resilience is the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems within a city to survive, adapt, and grow no matter what the chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience. Any important aspects of this definition, but really what we saw and what the previous slide tries to demonstrate is that shocks and stresses don't always have to be a negative impact, but rather opportunities to adapt and grow. Next slide, please. So in terms of responding, the program recognizes that resilience is about a complex group of systems and their need to function together. So it's not any single department or any single individual or any single institution's responsibility to respond to shocks and stresses, but rather it's a web of people, solutions, infrastructure, and information, and the capacity of those individuals within a system to work together to strengthen the city overall. We are after with 100 Resilient Cities. Next slide, please. This is a story of Sakarya province in Turkey, which is a highly earthquake-prone area. The Toyota facility in Turkey, after a 7.6 magnitude earthquake ismet, is still, as you can see from this aerial shot, standing, and despite a few breakdowns within the factory that you can't see from this view, really functional almost immediately after the quake. And it was engineered to withstand seismic shocks based on Toyota's extensive experience with earthquakes. And so when they built the factory, they strengthened the roads around it, and they also designed the plant with systems that were able to withstand this kind of shock. Next slide, please. Now, the rest of the province was not so fortunate. More than 17,000 people were killed and 50,000 injured by the same quake. There was between $3 and $6.5 million of damage, and 500,000 people were left homeless. Many different infrastructure systems were damaged, communication was disrupted, and there was an enormous economic impact across the region. And this is really a cautionary tale here. We see a factory fully functional, was able to withstand the stress, and within the same region, clearly the majority of the infrastructure was not able to, not because those practices are not known, but because they were not implemented. Next slide, please. So what is it that's going to enable cities to become more resilient? We see certain qualities in resilient cities that enable them to withstand, respond, and adapt more readily to shocks and stresses. And despite earlier discussions around resilience that some of these are innate or certain cities possess these traits, we believe that these traits can be expanded, and that any city can really take on these approaches to make themselves more resilient. So very important that a city be reflective and be open to learning from its mistakes and its past, that it be resourceful, ready to act, and robust, redundant, and flexible. So looking at different kinds of systems and how they can build in backups and redundancies into their own operations, and be flexible in the kinds of approaches that can be used in city management. And finally, resilient cities are inclusive and integrated. So they need to take account of city-wide needs and promote coordinated action. They need to engage widely with citizens and be open to their views and different kinds of solutions coming from various different parts of the community, leadership, public and private sector. Next slide, please. So how do we organize our thinking? Do something that we call the City Resilience Framework. And the City Resilience Framework is our guide or our lens and actors within a city and how a city can improve upon their current operations. Next. Now we divide the City Resilience Framework into 4 quadrants, which you can hear: health and well-being, economy and society, infrastructure and environment, and leadership and strategy. And you can see that in each of these quadrants, there are 3 drivers, so a total of 12 drivers of city resilience. And just to take a few as examples here, I spoke in the earlier slide about cities being able to reflect. And so we look here at leadership and strategy, that cities have the ability to foster long-term and integrated planning, thinking about what they're doing and then able to apply that going forward. In economy and society, the promoting cohesion and engaged communities, which goes to the point of inclusiveness. So we use the City Resilience Framework to sit down with and examine what they're doing and in which areas and which drivers of resilience are strong and which ones are not as strong. And I'll come back to that in the later slides. Next slide, please. This is just another quick case study, and this is a tale of 2 blackouts which happened here in New York, where I'm sitting right now. And in 1977, there was a first blackout. There were rampant looting, things were disorganized, and it was really not a safe place. There was a blackout in 1977. There was some police. Next slide, please. And the blackout caused more stress and more economic disruption to the city. Next slide, please. This is New York City in 2003, when there was another equally terrible blackout in terms of time, but it was wonderful in the sense that blackout resulted in block parties and people going out and talking to their neighbors. Here you see people calmly walking across the bridge home. And many people credit post 9/11 social cohesion and integrated feeling among citizens here in New York with the different attitude that people had. Next slide, please. You see here, despite the fact that people are weaving in and out of traffic, they're doing so in a fairly orderly way. Next slide, please. And you see here a packed bus, but not too unhappy bus of New Yorkers heading home during the blackout. Next slide, please. can see here a much more detailed picture of our city resilience framework. And if we go back down to economy and society, we can see under promotes cohesive and engaged communities, social support, local identity and culture, and community participation. And these are some of the drivers of a resilient city, of a city that can respond to a shock like a blackout, and instead of having rioting and disruption, have a positive attitude and have citizens that identify with one another, that help each other. Going on to the next slide. We see that in New York in 1977, this was not the case. We see there are red and yellow blocks here. This is how the city, in retrospect, rated itself. Green, as you might imagine, would be a good rating. Yellow would be medium, and red would be a problem. And looking back, thought that there were not nearly enough systems to ensure stability, security, and justice. Law enforcement relations community were a major problem, and there were not proper deterrents to crime. Next slide, please. Whereas here you see in 2003, if New Yorkers were asked about their relationship with police, their ability to promote safety and security, their reactions were much more positive. And there was also a much more positive feeling about what it was to be a New Yorker, a local identity and culture. Next slide, please. Now, how does this all relate to the program and what we're doing here at 100 Resilient Cities? Next slide. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the initiative was born out of Rockefeller's 100-year anniversary, the centennial, and also a recognition of different trends. This urbanization trend, and the fact that by 2050, 75% of us will be living in cities. Next slide, please. So when 100 Resilient Cities opened up the challenge in 2013, we invited cities from around the world to apply and to tell us why they wanted to become part of a network of the most resilient cities in the world. What was it to do to improve? So in our first year, we had 32 cities in Wave 1, and we've just admitted cities to Wave 2, and here you see a map of those cities. Those cities are everywhere around the world, and they actually represent, at this point, 750 million people. So more than 15% of the world's urban population is now in the 100 Resilient Cities network. Next slide, please. We have various different cities, as you'll note from this list. Cities who have their capacity, who are still striving to become more resilient. You see here Rotterdam in the Netherlands is listed, and one of the most important port cities in the world, as well as one of the most advanced when it comes to flood control. We also see cities here who are working hard to build up their resilience under new political systems, such as Mandalay in Myanmar. If you go to the next slide for Wave 2 cities, you'll see an equally diverse distribution, both regionally as well as in terms of population and stages of development. So what are the main issues that 100 Resilient Cities are trying to respond to? Next slide, please. Generally, we find that cities have problems responding to resilience challenges, shocks, and stresses because they're complex. There are many different city agencies. They're not integrated. They're insufficiently organized. And often, cities don't scale solutions effectively. They may have a solution problem that they're applying through the public utility, and the solution may have some kind of application in an energy space, but those two departments may not talk to each other. Likewise, a neighboring city solution, which could work in a regional scale, however, that city hasn't shared the solution with another. So in response to these challenges, 100 Resilient Cities provides member cities with 4 types of support. Next slide, please. You can see the 4 types of support that we provide here. The first is to fund a chief resilience officer, someone who becomes the point person for resilience at the city level. And the second one is we provide grant support for a city to develop a resilience strategy or a resilience roadmap for how to respond to the challenges they face in terms of shocks and stresses. And 2 grant interventions try to respond to the issue of insufficient organization and complexity in cities. And then in terms of scaling solutions, we have 2 interventions, a platform of services, and that's the team that I work on as the platform director. And this team is focused at looking at who are actors around the world, whether they be public sector, private sector, academic institutions, who really have best-in-class types of solutions, and how do we scale those to our cities so that we're not reinventing the wheel, that we're bringing practical, affordable solutions to our cities so that they can respond. And then finally, we have a peer-to-peer learning network. So we help cities to learn from one another and also bring knowledge into the network. So in terms of the first offering, the Chief Resilience Officer, who is this person and what does it mean to be a Chief Resilience Officer? It's actually a position that prior to our program didn't exist. Some cities had Chief Sustainability Officers, others had Chief Innovation Officers, all very exciting and related positions. But a Chief Resilience Officer is someone who has the challenge of trying to bring all of these multiple roles together. So the most important role this person has is to get cities to engage in a holistic planning process. And we sometimes call this person the Chief Silo Buster because they need to work across silos to create and implement a resilience strategy. They have to serve as a senior advisor to the mayor or municipal leader. And in fact, they have to have this role in order to be approved and to be hired by the city and paid for by 100 Resilient Cities. They have to promote resilience thinking and act as a global thought leaders. We ask our Chief Resilience Officers very often to speak to groups not unlike your own about going through 100 Resilient Cities and make sure that this resilience message is spread, and also to keep developing their own thinking based on the experience that they have acting as a Chief Resilience Officer in the city. They have to coordinate efforts across not only the government that they're working in, but also in terms of multiple stakeholders. So I mentioned public and private sector. I also mentioned in the earlier slides, inclusiveness is a very important quality for cities who want to become resilient. So Chief Resilience Officer has to be able to engage people from many different communities and many different walks that are involved in the city. And then finally, that Chief Resilience Officer has to liaise with other CROs from the other cities, with our staff up here at 100 Cities, and also service providers that are in the platform to identify what the solutions are bringing from the platform to the cities. Going to the next slide. This helps us to unpack and for me to give you a little bit of an overview of what our city strategy looks like. What does it mean for us to undertake a city resilience strategy? And so that's a 2-step process. The first part of the process takes about 6 to 9 weeks. And this is a self-assessment that the city goes through with that resilience framework that I took you through a little bit earlier, and to say where are the areas where we're doing very well in terms of those 4 quadrants, and where are the areas that we really need to improve. And out of that self-assessment comes resilience-focused areas and a customized approach to resilience for that city. Then in those priority areas, the city will do a deeper diagnostic and look at what opportunities and challenges are. What kind of resources are they spending responding to those challenge areas, and what kind of resources they need. And then finally, out of that information, they come up with a resilience strategy. What are the priorities and initiatives that they would like to implement in the short and medium term? Next slide, please. So once we have these priorities, that's when the cities will come to the platform and access services that have been pledged to us by platform partners. So you can see here that on the platform we have a very variety of platform partners that are making services available to cities. So in terms of getting in touch with citizens, managing that inclusive dialogue, a firm called Ushahidi provides mobile and web-based applications for people to interact with their government around resilience issues. Veolia, we have assessments of energy, waste, and water best practices, where the company will come in and look at cities' urban services delivery and identify areas where they can save and they can become more efficient. Next slide, please. And then based on this experience, we ask that the cities share with their peers how challenges. On one of the very first slides, I showed some of the shocks and stresses that cities face. A great many of them are facing similar stresses with regard to floods, with regard to seismic risk, with regard to aging population and aging or infrastructure. So if one city has a solution, they may share it with another city who can learn from their experience and perhaps apply the solution directly or a slightly modified version. Next slide. So with that, I will wrap up, and I'm very happy to take your questions. Thank you very much for listening to my brief introduction to our program. It's great to talk to you so far. Now I'm looking forward to hearing.
Great, Lauren, thank you so much. I'd encourage anyone on the phone who has, or online, who has any questions to go ahead and type their questions into the chat box on the right-hand side of your control panel. In the meantime, Lauren, I do have some questions for you myself. And one thing I'm wondering about is, are you trying, so I understand from reading different articles about different chief resiliency officers and meeting one in person here, how every city has its own focus of resiliency. So for example, in San Francisco, I know the chief resiliency officer here has a particular expertise in earthquakes, which makes perfect sense for our location. And I'm assuming that all these different cities are going to have their areas of expertise. When they come together to, what are you looking at in terms of outcomes when they create these kind of resiliency strategies? Are you looking for there to be a broader focus beyond their existing themes, a certain set of criteria that all cities need to cover? Do they need to cover everything on that wheel that you showed us?
That's a good question. I think cities, we want them to think about all of the drivers in the wheel, but it's important for cities to identify themselves what are the most important parts of the wheel for them to be working on as part of a resilience strategy. So as you mentioned, for San Francisco to have a CRO who has expertise in earthquake risk makes a lot of sense, because that's an area going forward and historically has been a major challenge for the city. However, there may be other stresses that aren't as well articulated, but are still causing sort of bubbling problems for a city. And that's why we go through that self-assessment, and we really encourage cities to have their workshops around this entire wheel with a very broad group. And during those sessions, it's interesting to see issues really come to the fore as a concern for the community members as well as the government, where those overlaps are. And so in that initial assessment, we really give the same weight to one's voice. So if 3 people mentioned needing to increase community participation and 1 person mentioned infrastructure, even if infrastructure is mentioned by someone from a government department and the community engagement is mentioned by community members, we'll weight that evenly in that first phase, just to get a sense of what the perceptions are around resilience issues in the community. Then as we go forward, we'll dig deeper into those issues and look at how they can be addressed at the city level.
Okay, thank you. That is helpful. And I'm keeping in mind right now the kind of people who are calling into this particular presentation. And I know that basically they represent the building and construction sector, all the way from, design, all the way through construction and material suppliers, through end of life and developers, the whole value chain of buildings. And of course, I see some of the links throughout this entire wheel, but could you maybe share from your side where you see the role of the building and construction sector in urban resilience?
Thanks, Michelle. This is a really, really important question, and we see a huge role for the building and construction sector to play. I think it's really impossible to address urban resilience without empowering both designers, construction companies, auditors, engineers in what they can do in their own firms, in their own offices, to mainstream resilience. If there are not adequate standards and professionals who are able to build to those standards and design to those standards, it's really impossible for us to advance the resilience agenda. So the role for the sector is really to pursue best practice and to also encourage better codes, even where there aren't adequate government regulations. I was having a conversation 2 weeks ago in Singapore with some designers from an architecture firm who are working in Mandalay in Myanmar. And they were talking about how they had designed to a very high standard at the request of a local construction company, but that was the exception rather than the rule. And if more and more firms are able to design to a higher standard and push the envelope and work with different parties to improve their capacity, that's really ideal. And that's what we look for in terms of platform partners.
Okay. That's good. So codes being important, so pushing for better codes. And I'm wondering where let's see, areas for resiliency improvements and infrastructure improvements have been identified. Or is there, I guess I would like to kind of bring around to the topic, and I don't know if this is something you can speak to, but public-private partnerships. So I went to a resiliency conference a few months ago held by the Urban Land Institute. It was here in San Francisco. It was a national conference where there were some interesting speakers, and they talked a lot about how the role of public-private partnerships in basically contributing to supporting a better infrastructure. Where the focus, a lot of the conference was about increasing sea levels and what cities could do to address those sea levels, prepare themselves for rising sea levels. And maybe, well, you might not be able to cite any specific examples, in which areas or how through this program are you encouraging cities to partner with the private sector? Or is that based on, or I don't know if it may be based, if it's a city-to-city question?
We encourage cities to partner with the private sector through our platform.
Okay.
And we ask for platform partners, for people who are interested in becoming platform partners, to reach out to us and to talk to us about what it is they are interested in doing in the resilience space. So you see here, and I mentioned Veolia as a private sector partner, coming in with their energy, waste, and water best practice assessments and offering to go into cities and tell them how to improve and increase efficiency. We have a construction company out of Asia who's come in and said, we want to see the construction work in our city, and so we're willing to give some free time in terms of assessing pre-feasibility studies for projects to build more resilient developments in a certain range of cities in a certain region or sub-region. We have a platform that's available for private sector actors to come to us and say where they're interested in working, what they're interested in working on in the resilient space, and then we help to match that with the city needs coming out of the strategy.
Oh, that's very interesting. So, for example, if someone on this call works for a company that they think could really contribute, has an asset to contribute to be a part of this platform, how should they go about doing that? Making contact with you?
So through email, that would be the best way.
Okay.
I can certainly share my contact details after this call. And I can give a little bit more information about how our platform works. Our platform, as I mentioned, really it's a pool of information of abilities and competencies from different companies, where each company pledges a certain amount of in-kind services to cities. As I don't know if it's obvious from our relationship with Rockefeller, but we are a not-for-profit project, so we cannot promote a certain private sector firm to sell services. We can't do any product placement or service placement in that regard. However, we can connect cities to private sector that have at least scoping or technical assistance that they can provide in kind for cities to improve their resilience planning. So if anyone on the call works for a company that has, either through their corporate social responsibility or even through existing staff time, the ability to work with cities to try to do resilience planning on the front end, we really welcome that kind of partnership.
Okay, and so all of these companies here on the platform that we see now, they have all offered in-kind contributions.
Correct. So their in-kind contribution is what's in these capital letters here. So we don't have access to all their products. Of course, many of their products are still only offered to cities on a cost recovery basis, but they will offer feasibility studies or risk assessment tools at the front end for cities to analyze and understand their risks.
Okay. So another question that I have, so we had a question, a request to show the way that cities are being supported. So I think it's in this part of the kind of 4 components to the, here we go. So request to show this. So this leads to another question that I have, which is, so, you've got your, on nearly 70 cities that are already a part of your program, but another wave of cities coming through. I know there are a few representatives from green building councils on this call. If they have cities in their countries that they think should nominate themselves to be a part of that third wave, is that possible? What's the process for a city becoming a part of this group?
To your first question, absolutely. There's room to encourage cities to apply for the third wave. That will happen sometime around Q2 of next year. The application process will open up, and we very much welcome first group of cities. And to your second question, can you repeat the second question?
It was really like, what is the process for applying to be a part of this group?
The application process is fairly straightforward. We ask that cities summarize what concerns are, shocks and stresses, and rank those. We also ask that they provide information about how the chief executive of the city, or the mayor in many cases, is interested in supporting resilience. We think that it's absolutely essential to have commitment from the very top. Next, we ask cities to describe how they would use a chief resilience officer, what the person would do, and what part of the city government they would work in to make sure that there is adequate support for the initiative. And finally, we ask cities to talk about what some of their prior experience is related to planning for resilience. Do they have any plans in place related to disaster risk management, related to climate change, related to innovation? And how are those being managed at this point?
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. And we did have another question, someone asking, can a country have two cities enrolled, or would this be seen as a redundancy? I'm not sure where your map is of the cities. I think it's, oh, here it is. So it looks to me like you do, some of the larger countries do have more than one city in per country, but is that is there a limit to, if you're in a smaller country, would that be seen as unlikely, or kind of what are some of your criteria? Maybe you could share some of your criteria for judging or enrollment.
So to that question, certainly we do have countries with multiple cities. We have Thessaloniki and also Athens in Greece. We have about 18 cities in the U.S. We now have 2 cities in Colombia. So that is welcome. What we look for from cities is really the responses to the questions that I mentioned, the quality of those responses. So what are the main shocks or stresses? How is the city working to address those? What the city is interested in getting out of the program in terms of how they would use a chief resilience officer and the strategy process to contribute to their city planning. And we're really looking for cities also who governments have staying power. So if the mayor's office and those who are preparing the application, if they're going to be working in the city for the next 2 or 3 years and have enough time to work on the resilience strategy and then implement the resilience strategy. So we're looking for a committed chief executive. We're looking for a city that's willing to engage in at least a medium-term partnership with our project. We're looking for cities who are aware of what their challenges are and who are prepared to leverage the kinds of support that we're offering to meet them.
Great. We have a few more questions rolling in now. I think this question about which kind of cities can apply has piqued a lot of interest. And there's wondering who within the city makes the application. Does it need to be a city representative that makes the application, and anyone in particular within that city?
We're very open actually to different civil society, or it could be, you know, a group of engineers or a group of itself could prepare the application. What's absolutely about the application process is that there be a letter of support from the mayor or chief executive of the city. So there has to be buy-in from the government. They have to be fully aware of what is in the application, help to drive the process. But the application itself can be prepared by an interested party in the city.
Okay, great. I'm getting a few questions. You cut out for just 1 second, so I want to answer one of the questions that just came up. Was yes, the question is, a local GBC can prepare the application as long as there is a letter of support. Let's see, another question that came in is someone wanting more information on the role of the Rockefeller Foundation. Maybe you could describe kind of that relationship between 100 Resilient Cities program. You mentioned you're a nonprofit in relationship to the Rockefeller Foundation, and then more details on the actual funding levels that are provided. I think there's a slide on that as well in here. But if you could talk about the relationship first.
the relationship of the foundation is that the foundation is financing 100 resilient cities and providing a lot of thought leadership. The resilience in other areas in terms of innovation, rebuild by design after Superstorm Sandy, and the cooperation that the foundation has led with DHS, and then also work that the Fund done around climate change resilience in cities. There was a network of 10 cities in Asia called the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, which had programming over the last several years to do resilience planning specifically for climate change in countries in South and Southeast Asia. So building on all of the lessons, they launched 100 resilient cities. And so they'll do provide quite a lot of guidance and thought leadership as the grant maker, and did the program to, as I mentioned, the amount of 100. That can be a little bit misleading because it's a $1 million grant. It's actually a very different kind of support, and it's based on what the limits are. And obviously, as I mentioned, with the resilience officer, we're paying their salary at locally appropriate scales. So the amount of the grant is not really $1 million, but rather the entire project and has that budget from the Rockefeller Foundation.
Okay, you did cut out a little bit there. I don't know if everyone can hear what I did. So just to clarify, so basically the funding kind of varies by location based on locally appropriate salaries and costs and other things. And also some of the money goes to fund the platform and other services per city. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, great. Let's see, we're getting close to time here, and I'm just wondering if there are any other questions from anyone else on the call. So it sounds like, to summarize how a private sector might get engaged in, so is through the platform. If they have services they might like to offer in kind that specifically target cities, they can contact you at the 100 Resilient Cities effort. And what we can do is send out an email to everyone who is registered with your email address. Was that okay? Do you mind if we do that?
Yes, I really welcome emails from people on this call who are interested in helping cities to build their resilience. I think there's a lot of expertise and a lot of great know-how and certainly ideas and approaches that replicate and scale.
Okay, great. And I think from our side, the Sustainable Cities Initiative, we see the role of the building sector of being quite big, and we do see the challenge and the opportunity in this for the building and construction sector, both in terms of retrofit and new city development, and of course want to see more sustainable cities, more resilient cities in the long term. For those interested parties or green building councils on the phone, their third wave of cities, sounds like applications are going to be due in you said the second quarter of 2015? And would those applications be available on your website as well?
Yes, the application, when it's launched, will be made available on our website. It will be made available probably around end of the next year, and then there's some time to apply, so it will probably be due during the third quarter.
Okay, great. Well, I don't see any more questions coming through. So with that, I would really like to thank you, Lauren, so much for calling in today. We really appreciate it. We're very pleased to have Rockefeller be a part of our speaker series. And I hope that, or the 100 Resilient Cities program, be a part of our speaker series. And I hope some of the people on the call today do get in touch with you. Of course, we have members all over the world, and for many people around the world are sleeping right now. It's late at night. So we have recorded this presentation, and it will be available online on our website for anyone interested to call. So if you have colleagues out there who were not able to join the call, please let them know. They can find it on our website. And thank you again, Lauren, and thank you so much to everyone who called in today.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.